Now, I've just been writing a paper about what the Named Person Initiative has been about, which in part I've called third way parenting, which is how I would describe the type of parenting that's been developed in Britain. Just a little bit about myself first. I'm a lecturer in sociology and criminology at Abertay University. Themes that I've been looking at that are of interest in terms of this are things like early intervention and the fact that we're moving towards more and more early intervention types initiatives, which I think at times can be quite problematic. I've also been trying to write on the issue of privacy in the family and the idea of autonomy and the autonomy of the family, which I would argue doesn't exist anymore, at least at the level of policy. There's no recognition of the idea of autonomy for the family as a positive good in and of itself. And I've also been looking at, and I wrote a paper on a rather ugly title, The Anti-Socialization of Everyday Life, which essentially tries to look at the way that professionals increasingly are involved in personal relationships at all different levels, and even in professional relationships where they shouldn't necessarily be there, and what the outcomes are of this. And my other hat, if you like, is about 15 years ago I set up a charity called Generation Youth Issues. And one of the things that it was looking at was what we described as cotton wool kids in terms of the overprotected nature of children today. In fact, a friend of mine he's interviewed a lot of 70-plus people to sort of look at what their childhood was like in comparison with today's childhood. And as you can imagine, they would travel to the moon to get to school and kind of then come back because they've forgotten their sandwiches. Today they kind of ferry to school and so on. I'm sure we're all very familiar with this. One of the things that was particularly interesting at that time was I started to look at this thing about swim safety. And the swim safety is developed as a policy. So if you went along with a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old to a swimming pool by yourself, you probably wouldn't get in because they have a swim safety policy about how many children per adult because they're concerned about the children's safety. And as a friend of mine said to the swimming manager who was refusing to let them in, do you love my children more than I do? Which I thought was a very good question, because essentially saying this man is saying you can't be trusted with your own children because you are putting them at risk, and you'll find you can't take young children to the swimming pool more than one by yourself anymore. And I mention that because I think to some extent the way I would explain the development of policy, government, and all these various initiatives that develop in society, or at least the people that do it, is that we should almost forgive them because they know not what they do. That's how I would describe it. I don't think a lot of this is done with malicious intent at all. I think it's actually that we have the development of a very technocratic, procedural approach to everyday life that has developed within institutions, which means that common sense often goes out of the window, and many other things aside. So, for example, the privacy of the family, I think, is being profoundly undermined by the Named Person Initiative. I don't know if you know, there's this thing called N-grams. If you don't know it, use it. It's fantastic. Just N and then grams, G-R-A-M-S. Right? Google it, click on it. It's Google's search of 5.2 million books that they've got in their system. And you can type in a word and it will graph the percentage amount that word is used since 1800 to 2000. So, for example, if you put in vulnerable groups, you will find that the graph, and they almost all go like this, the graph will go, it doesn't exist until from 1800 to 1960, like that. Okay, vulnerable groups. So it exponentially increases from the 1960s. And I say that because one of a few categories that I think are very important for trying to understand what's happening with parenting. The first one I would say is the category of vulnerability and the expansion of the idea that people are vulnerable, particularly children, but not just children, more than just children. There's a lot of talk about resilience today. So if you do an Ngram search on resilience, you will find, no, is it resilient child, or anyway, it's either resilient child or childhood resilience, something like that. Basically, it doesn't exist as a term that's been used in books, at least on their search, until around 1995, and then suddenly it shoots up, and there's a discussion about resilient children. Right, now that sounds good, but it's actually not, because the basis of the development of the idea of resilience is predicated on the idea that children are vulnerable and need resilience. That's where the discussion comes from. So in a kind of sociologically, the first order category is vulnerability. The second order category is resilience, because that's kind of like a boil that grows on the category of vulnerability. And so you get this development, this concept, resilient childhood resilience, developing from around 1995. And you can see this with a lot of these uses of concepts and terms, which essentially where within sociology, within policy, within politics, within professionalization, within our culture, we've suddenly developed an idea that children are profoundly and fundamentally vulnerable. Not just children, but significantly children. And therefore, they are at risk. And again, if you do an at-risk, it's the same at-risk 1960s, 1970s exponential growth of a category of at-risk, which isn't just about children, but children, again, are significant in this. So an escalation in the idea that children are profoundly fragile, at risk, and potentially in danger. I think that's the first major thing that's developed over the last in the last generation. The second one, I think, is the professionalization of parenting. Parenting, I'd say now, is argued to be a skills-based activity, okay, which is new. This was not how parenting was understood in the past. It is now entirely accepted within social policy as a skill-based activity. If you read policy documents now, almost all of them say government historically have said we shouldn't get involved in parents, and of course parents are dead important. We love parents, we love the family, blah, 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 but parents need support. Okay, and it's almost universally accepted now that this idea that parents need support. Okay, no idea that parents can actually get on with things themselves. Parents need support, and they don't just mean some parents; they mean all parents. Of course, they mean some parents more than others, but it's become a universally accepted thing. So there's a discussion about parenting classes. Children, I would say, within 10 years, most children will probably be being taught parenting classes in school, I would guess. And parenting classes for parents will quite potentially expand as well. So there's an expectation that parents need professional guidance. And that, I would say, in social policy is almost universally accepted to be the case. I'd also say within that framework, there is very little, if any, recognition of the importance of privacy. Right? And that's one of the areas I think I should try and look at in terms of how do you defend privacy? Why is privacy important? Might seem common sense to us in many respects, but very few people, certainly within sociology, are writing anything in defense of privacy, why this is a crucial aspect of life. And families have become invisible. So if you look at the Act, this is a Children and Young Person Act that the Named Person Initiative is embedded in. Maggie Mellon makes this point, who sometimes makes the point that the term families isn't used once in the Act. Right? If you look at the term corporate parenting, that's used about 50 times. Right? So they don't mention family, they don't mention families, but they do talk a lot about corporate parenting. And families have become increasingly invisible within social policy and law. And I would argue the result, which there's been a fairly long discussion about this historically, but I think much more has escalated over the last generation or so. I think you could quite comfortably talk about the colonization of family life in terms of what's actually taken place in family and social policy. Finally, which it kind of links to the vulnerability question, and I shouldn't really use it because there's no need to, but I like it as a concept. But it's the idea of diminished subjectivity. And essentially all that means is that we are diminished in terms of our capacity. Right? So society has a diminished sense of our capacity to cope. And without going into all of these, I used this example with my students today and they liked it, so I'll use it again. The one that I hate more than anything else are the taxi queue helpers. Now, some of you may not have come across these people, but if you ever drink in Glasgow, we've had taxi queues for 200 years, possibly more. So 200 years ago, some guy would have come up in his horse and carriage, there'd be a queue of people all drunk, so, oh, you get to the back, and swearing and, you know, all the rest of it, and sorting it out. And you're all drunk and sort of like, you know, there's some idiot tries to get in the front, you know, to argue with him and all the rest of it. But, you know, we've managed, well, you know, we've struggled hard and managed to get home. Nowadays, if you go to Glasgow, there's these people paid in little yellow jackets who come along and say, oh yeah, could you queue? Yeah, I'm queuing. Oh, here's your taxi. Oh, right, thanks. That's what a taxi looks like. And they help you in their taxi. And they are basically safe taxi people. That's their job, is to help you to get into your taxi. Now, if they don't think that we can get into a taxi without some sort of support, it's probably not surprising that they don't think we can look after our children either. Because it's a lot harder to look after children than it is to get into a taxi after you've had a few pints in Glasgow. And it's a joke, right? So we laugh, that we think it's a funny example, but you could go through so many areas of life where this development of support workers has become institutionalized and systematically, especially at schools in terms of what kids are not expected to be able to cope with today at schools. So I think they're three things, I think, that at least in part help explain why the named person has developed, and implicit within that is obviously I have concerns about this development.